Do you believe in blood over everything, or not anymore?
They stood there on my porch that crisp autumn afternoon 7 years after the betrayal had first shattered our family ties, my parents Robert and Linda appearing friendlier than the last time I had seen them in person, their faces carrying a mixture of tentative hope and underlying desperation that I could sense even before they uttered a word. And as I slowly swung the door open just wide enough to take in the full sight of Robert in his faded baseball cap tilted slightly against the wind and Linda gripping her worn purse like it held the remnants of their excuses, I locked eyes with them for what felt like an eternity, pregnant with all the unresolved pain and silent accusations that had accumulated over the decades. Then, without offering so much as a greeting or a hint of the forgiveness they so clearly sought, I gently but firmly pulled the door closed again, the sharp click of the latch resonating through the quiet suburban street like the final punctuation on a long overdue chapter of my life, leaving me to walk back inside with a hollow sense of triumph intertwined with that persistent undercurrent of sorrow which always lingers when the deepest family wounds refuse to fully heal. To grasp the full weight of why I chose that wordless rejection in the present moment, one must journey back to the sweltering summer day 7 years prior when my carefully constructed world as a 38-year-old divorced mother in suburban Ohio began to fracture irreparably under the strain of a medical crisis that exposed the true priorities lurking beneath the surface of our familial bonds, a time when I was working long hours as a receptionist in a hectic Cleveland clinic just to keep the roof over our heads and food on the table for myself and my 8-year-old son Tommy, who had always been the bright spark in my otherwise routine existence, with his boundless energy, quick wit, and those spontaneous hugs that made even the most exhausting shifts feel worthwhile until a seemingly ordinary pediatric checkup transformed into a harrowing revelation as the doctor pulled me aside in the sterile examination room to explain Tommy's undiagnosed congenital heart defect, a condition that had been quietly progressing and now demanded immediate surgical intervention estimated by the specialists at a staggering $85,000 even after our modest insurance coverage had been applied. A figure that slammed into me with the force of an unexpected storm because my personal savings barely stretched to cover a single month's rent, let alone such an astronomical sum that threatened to upend everything I had fought to stabilize since my divorce 3 years earlier. That very night, as I paced the narrow confines of my modest kitchen under the harsh fluorescent light with the phone clutched tightly in my trembling hand, I dialed the number for my parents' retirement home in sunny Florida, where they had relocated after Dad's retirement from his decades-long stint at the local auto parts factory, convinced in my naivety that blood ties and their roles as grandparents to my only child would compel them to step up in this dire hour. So I poured out the entire devastating story over the line in a voice that wavered despite my efforts to stay composed, detailing the specifics of Tommy's fading energy during his beloved soccer practices, the subtle bluish tint to his lips that had started appearing more frequently, and the urgent timeline the cardiologist had outlined for the procedure to prevent irreversible damage. Yet Robert's reply cut through the connection like a cold blade as he declared without hesitation that $85,000 was simply too much for them to commit given the sanctity of their hard-earned nest egg built over 40 years of frugal living. And Linda followed up in her characteristically soft but unyielding tone by suggesting I explore community fundraisers, hospital payment plans, or even crowdfunding appeals. As if those patchwork solutions could somehow mitigate the terror of watching my son's life hang in such precarious balance while I juggled overtime and anxiety-fueled insomnia. Although the sting of their refusal pierced deep into my core, forcing me to confront the uncomfortable reality that the family support I had always assumed was there might be more illusion than substance, I forced myself to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat and project a facade of determination, reassuring them briefly that we would manage before hanging up and immediately shifting into survival mode by signing up for extra shifts at the clinic, launching a modest online campaign through social media to rally distant friends and coworkers, and negotiating with the hospital's billing department for the earliest possible surgery date that our scraped-together funds could accommodate, all while Tommy remained blissfully unaware of the financial storm brewing around his fragile health as he chattered excitedly about school projects and weekend adventures. The true depth of the hypocrisy embedded in their decision only began to reveal itself a few agonizing months later. Precisely as Tommy lay recovering in his hospital bed, surrounded by the rhythmic beeps of monitors and the faint antiseptic scent of the pediatric ward. His small frame finally starting to regain some color and vitality after the successful operation that had demanded every ounce of my resolve to make happen, when a thick envelope arrived in the mail bearing the elegant return address of a wedding planner and containing an invitation to my younger sister Sarah's upcoming nuptials. A lavish destination event set on the pristine beaches of the Bahamas that promised an unforgettable celebration for 200 guests, complete with custom invitations printed on heavy stock paper and subtle gold embossing. And as I unfolded the glossy details in disbelief, learning from a subsequent call to a chatty cousin about the preliminary costs already approaching $230,000 for elements like imported floral arrangements, a celebrity officiant, and private villa accommodations. A wave of incredulity washed over me, because how could the same parents who had deemed $85,000 an insurmountable barrier for their grandson's life-saving procedure now endorse and fund such an extravagant spectacle that prioritized social spectacle over survival without a second thought? Sarah had long occupied the favored position in our family dynamic, 5 years my junior, with her effortless charisma, thriving career in marketing that afforded her the kind of lifestyle I could only dream of, and that innate ability to draw admiration and resources toward her ambitions, while I had always played the role of the reliable workhorse, handling the unglamorous realities like caring for aging relatives or mediating sibling squabbles without seeking the spotlight. So receiving that invitation amid Tommy's tender convalescence felt like a deliberate slap, igniting a slow-burning resentment that questioned not just their financial choices, but the very foundation of love and equity within our bloodline. And in the immediate aftermath, I chose to bypass the obligatory family conference call that Sarah had organized to hype the event, opting instead to leave a pointed voicemail message laced with understated sarcasm about how refreshing it must be to invest in grand milestones when quieter triumphs like a child's restored health often go underappreciated. My words delivered in a tone that masked the raw hurt, but ensured they registered the undercurrent of disapproval before I disconnected without waiting for rebuttals. Deriving a fleeting sense of empowerment from that small act of boundary setting, even as it isolated me further from the circle they were so eagerly expanding. Yet just as I began to convince myself that this budding rift might remain containable if I focused on Tommy's steady progress and our emerging normalcy, additional murmurs from extended relatives began to filter in through text messages and casual phone chats, describing how the wedding budget had already escalated beyond initial estimates due to Sarah's impulsive additions like a live band flown in from Nashville and personalized welcome gifts for every attendee. Whispers that hinted at even deeper layers of disparity and potential consequences lurking just beyond the horizon, leaving me to lie awake at night pondering whether this ostentatious affair would ultimately expose fractures in their own carefully curated facade that could alter the trajectory of our fractured relationships in ways none of us had yet anticipated. Those insidious details about Sarah's wedding continued to seep into my awareness, like persistent leaks in a roof during the fragile period of Tommy's post-surgery recovery. When he was finally back home in our modest Ohio suburb and gradually reclaiming his playful spirit by chasing our scruffy terrier around the backyard with renewed vigor that brought tears to my eyes even as it exhausted me from the constant monitoring of his energy levels and medication schedules, yet every unsolicited text from a nosy aunt or forwarded email from distant cousins painted an increasingly vivid and infuriating portrait of opulent excess that stood in stark, mocking contrast to the stack of medical invoices piling up on my kitchen counter. Invoices that detailed therapies and follow-ups still costing us hundreds weekly, while my parents apparently saw no issue in channeling $230,000 into what Sarah breathlessly described in her updates as the event of a lifetime. Complete with chartered flights for 200 guests from across the country, a celebrity wedding planner whose expertise came at a premium steep enough to fund Tommy's entire cardiac rehab program for years, and elaborate setups like imported orchids flown in from Hawaii that wilted dramatically under the tropical sun, but were replaced without a second thought. all of which made my stomach churn with a resentment that deepened each time I tallied my own overtime hours at the clinic just to cover copays and keep our health insurance from lapsing. I poured my efforts into maintaining a semblance of normalcy for Tommy, enrolling him in gentle summer camps focused on low-impact activities to rebuild his confidence, while I juggled double shifts and late-night budgeting sessions on my laptop, occasionally allowing myself a wry internal chuckle at the absurdity of it all when Sarah's messages popped up with photos of her endless dress fittings in shimmering lace gowns adorned with crystals that caught the light like distant stars, her casual queries about whether the veil complemented her something borrowed tradition feeling particularly tone-deaf given the backdrop of our recent ordeal. And though I responded with measured politeness to avoid escalating family drama prematurely, inwardly I seethed at the entitlement radiating from her digital boasts, wondering how she could revel in such frivolity when her nephew's brush with mortality had barely registered on her radar beyond a single get-well card that arrived weeks late and unsigned by anyone but her. The internal tug-of-war intensified as the official invitation materialized in our mailbox a few weeks before the event, its heavy cardstock and embossed lettering exuding an air of exclusivity that included travel stipends for attendees they insisted were negligible expenses drawn from unspecified family resources, forcing me into a profound dilemma about whether to attend this Bahamian extravaganza despite the rage simmering just beneath my composed exterior, because declining outright would cement my reputation as the grudge-holding outlier in our extended family circle where appearances mattered more than authenticity, painting me as ungrateful or petty to relatives who had no inkling of the surgery refusal's sting. Yet showing up meant subjecting myself and, by extension, Tommy's memory to a weekend of forced merriment amid toasts to matrimonial bliss and dances under starlit skies, all while pretending the $85,000 barrier my parents erected for his life had never existed, a choice that felt profoundly disagreeable even to me as I weighed it in solitary late nights, recognizing how it positioned me as complicit in their skewed narrative of priorities where weddings trumped well-being, ultimately deciding to go alone after arranging for Tommy to stay with a trusted neighbor under the guise of a fun sleepover week, rationalizing it as a necessary step toward some elusive closure, though deep down I knew it prolonged my own emotional turmoil more than it resolved anything. The wedding ceremony itself unfolded on that idyllic stretch of Bahamian beach like a meticulously scripted production from a glossy bridal magazine, with towering floral arches woven from exotic blooms that perfumed the salty air and a string quartet serenading the procession through the humid afternoon breeze. Robert escorting Sarah down a petal-strewn aisle in his ill-fitting rented tuxedo that bunched uncomfortably at the shoulders while she glided in her billowing gown resembling the sails of a luxury yacht ready to set course for endless indulgence, and Linda perched in the front row dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief as she murmured to nearby guests about the perfection of the moment. The kind of gathering that broadcasted their ascent into a veneer of affluence even as I lingered toward the back in my simple off-the-rack sundress, sipping a lukewarm cocktail. That did little to numb the irony twisting in my chest while fielding superficial inquiries from cousins about Tommy's health delivered with that patronizing sympathy that always made me want to lash out, but instead prompted tight-lipped assurances of his progress. Amid the mounting frustration, pockets of unintended humor emerged to punctuate the farce, such as during the interminable best man speech extolling the virtues of eternal commitment when I spotted Dad surreptitiously piling extra shrimp onto his plate from the lavish seafood buffet, his expression comically guilty like a teenager caught raiding the fridge, or the way Sarah's affluent new in-laws regaled the crowd with tales of their private jet escapades that elevated the entire affair to the level of a tawdry reality television episode where fiscal recklessness masqueraded as romance, eliciting my silent amusement at how they all pranced through this overblown charade as if the real world of medical debts and quiet sacrifices didn't exist just a flight away, and in those fleeting moments, I found a bitter levity in mentally dubbing the spectacle that ridiculous wedding circus, where priorities got lost in the confetti. A light vulgarity underscoring the wasteful pomp that still gnawed at my sense of fairness. However, the evening's reception unveiled a sharper twist when I wandered near the edges of the open-air pavilion to escape the throbbing music and inadvertently overheard Linda engaged in a hushed phone conversation with the event coordinator. Her voice laced with uncharacteristic sharpness as she negotiated an additional charge for extended lighting after dark, but ultimately capitulating to the expense, with a resigned sigh that spoke volumes about her willingness to bend finances for appearances. And later, as the night deepened and a slightly inebriated cousin drew me into a corner for confidential gossip, she revealed how the overall expenditure had surged past initial projections thanks to Sarah's on-a-whim decisions like importing fireworks for a spectacular display over the ocean that lit up the sky in bursts of color, but likely incinerated thousands in the process. A disclosure that crystallized the disposability of their resources in comparison to the grueling battle I had waged for Tommy's survival. Seizing a subtle opportunity for retribution amid the celebratory haze, I rose during the round of toasts with my glass aloft and offered a toast centered on the profound joy found in celebrations that mend what has been broken within the heart rather than merely adorning the surface, phrasing it ambiguously enough to evoke a collective nod of agreement while ensuring the pointed subtext lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge to their values, observing the brief flicker of unease cross my parents' features amid the clinking of crystal that provided a small but gratifying measure of equilibrium in the imbalance they had imposed. Yet, as the festivities dragged into the wee hours and I retreated early to the solitude of my modest hotel room overlooking the restless Atlantic waves crashing against the shore in rhythmic indifference, a persistent undercurrent of unease began to surface from an earlier fragment of overheard dialogue during the cocktail hour. Something cryptic about Robert's recent investment setbacks necessitating careful maneuvering to absorb the event's overruns without alerting the family, a hint that their commitment to this grand illusion might have imposed unforeseen fractures upon their own stability far beyond what the glossy invitation suggested, compelling me to stare into the darkness wondering if the roots of their preferential choices stemmed from a hidden desperation that could redefine the contours of betrayal in ways I had yet to fully comprehend. The ensuing years following that Bahamian spectacle dissolved into a purposeful expanse of emotional detachment that I nurtured meticulously, much like tending a garden overgrown with invasive vines which threatened to choke out the new growth I was determined to cultivate in the fertile soil of our independent life, channeling all my energies into Tommy's evolving journey as he navigated the turbulent waters of adolescence and emerged into young adulthood with a resilience that both humbled and inspired me. Witnessing his high school graduation where he strode confidently across the stage to accept his diploma with that familiar mischievous grin now framed by the stature of a young man towering over me and harboring aspirations of pursuing engineering at the nearby community college that filled our modest home with blueprints and late-night study sessions, while I advanced steadily in my career at the clinic from receptionist to office manager, overseeing a team of nurses and handling administrative complexities that brought a reliable salary sufficient to eliminate the perpetual specter of debt and afford us small luxuries like weekend hikes in the Appalachian foothills or upgrading our aging minivan to something more dependable. Yet this self-imposed isolation exacted its toll through the ritualistic arrival of holiday cards from my parents each December bearing cheerful accounts of their Florida pursuits, such as leisurely golf outings under palm-shaded courses and updates on Sarah's burgeoning family life, complete with photos of her new suburban home and infant twins that always included a veiled invitation to reconnect over the holidays, invitations I consistently discarded into the recycling bin without reply, preferring instead to forge our own traditions through potluck gatherings with the close-knit neighbors who had become an extended family of sorts, sharing stories around backyard fires and exchanging handmade gifts that emphasized presence over pretense. Though the weight of that chosen silence pressed heaviest during those intimate evenings when Tommy, now perceptive beyond his years, would casually inquire about why Grandpa and Grandma's calls had dwindled to nothing over the past half-decade, prompting me to deflect with evasive tales of their busy retirement schedule involving volunteer work at the local senior center or spontaneous cruises along the Gulf Coast, inwardly cringing at how my unyielding stance inadvertently positioned him as Collateral in a grudge match he had no part in initiating. A disagreeable complication that forced me to confront the possibility that my pursuit of justice might be inflicting unintended hardships on the very person I sought to protect most profoundly. Simmering conflicts arose sporadically from these everyday triggers, flaring up unbidden when a television commercial for destination weddings evoked vivid recollections of Sarah's over-the-top affair with its cascading fountains of champagne and synchronized fireworks that now seemed like relics from a bygone era of familial delusion. Or when Linda's belated birthday package for Tommy materialized on our doorstep containing a thoughtfully selected remote-controlled drone that he assembled with glee over an entire weekend, but which I relegated to the garage shelf after a single flight, too entangled in residual bitterness to permit it as a conduit for reconciliation that might dilute the lessons of self-reliance I had instilled in him. And amid these tensions, I discovered wry humor in the mundane acts of resistance, such as dubbing my email spam filter with a nickname inspired by their persistent newsletters and smirking at the irony of their idyllic updates vanishing into digital oblivion. Or that one afternoon when I unearthed the unused wedding favor soaps from the trip buried in a drawer and donated them anonymously to a women's shelter downtown, deriving a quiet satisfaction from repurposing those symbols of excess into something tangibly useful while mentally labeling the entire event as that bloated family soap opera where misplaced affections got washed away in a tide of better priorities. A touch of light vulgarity coloring my private reflections on the wasteful extravagance that had once overshadowed our survival. The narrative took an unforeseen twist one crisp spring morning as I delved into the cluttered attic while preparing for a neighborhood garage sale. My hands sifting through dusty cardboard boxes filled with relics from my pre-motherhood days, including faded photo albums and forgotten mementos. When I uncovered a sealed envelope yellowed with age addressed in Robert's distinctive scrawl to Linda and dated mere weeks before the surgery refusal, its contents unfolding a raw confession penned in his unsteady hand about the precarious state of their finances, eroded not by the nest egg they had professed to safeguard so fiercely, but by a series of ill-advised stock investments in volatile tech startups that had plummeted during the market dip, revealing how Sarah's insistent vision for a dream wedding had compelled them to liquidate assets and incur hidden loans to maintain the facade of abundance. A disclosure that reframed their denial of aid to me not solely as favoritism toward the prodigal daughter, but as a desperate maneuver to avert total financial collapse for the sake of preserving the family's outward image. And though this revelation stirred a turbulent mix of empathy and indignation within me, suggesting layers of vulnerability beneath their resolute exterior, I hastily refolded the letter and returned it to the box's depths, unwilling to allow this glimpse into their frailties to erode the boundaries I had erected with such painstaking effort. The emotional dilemma reached its zenith approximately 2 years ago during a routine follow-up appointment for Tommy that unexpectedly escalated into a midnight emergency room visit when echoes of his congenital condition resurfaced in the form of irregular heart rhythms triggered by a viral infection, confining him to observation under fluorescent lights for an overnight stay that resurrected the primal terror of those initial diagnosis days, as I sat vigil by his bedside, holding his hand and whispering reassurances while the monitors beeped in ominous cadence. And in that vulnerable interlude of waiting for test results amid the sterile hum of the hospital corridor, my fingers instinctively reached for my phone to dial my parents' number, hovering over the call button as visions of shared grief and potential support flickered through my mind, contemplating how extending an olive branch in this moment of crisis might finally dissolve the years of estrangement and grant Tommy the intergenerational bonds he deserved despite the risks of reopening old wounds. Yet ultimately I withdrew my hand and pocketed the device, opting once more for solitary endurance that struck me even then as stubbornly prideful and potentially short-sighted, a decision laden with the kind of self-sabotage that would undoubtedly frustrate observers who might advocate for vulnerability as the true path to mending fractured ties rather than perpetuating cycles of isolation. In the spirit of measured retribution during that holiday season shortly thereafter, I crafted and mailed a personalized newsletter chronicling our year's triumphs with high-resolution images of Tommy's academic accolades, his first part-time job at a local engineering firm, and snapshots of our fulfilling community volunteer trips, but addressed it exclusively to Sarah with an accompanying note expressing how gratifying it was to witness authentic aspirations soaring unencumbered by external validations, a deliberate omission of my parents from the recipients list that allowed the glowing narrative to underscore their absence through implication alone, delivering a witty sting wrapped in positivity that I imagined eliciting a pang of exclusion amid their festive gatherings and providing a satisfying reclamation of our story on my own unapologetic terms. Existence progressed in this vein of cautious equilibrium, marked by incremental victories and subdued heartaches, until the chill of last winter descended and shattered the fragile stasis when my cell phone illuminated with Robert's long-dormant contact after 3 full years of unbroken quiet, his voice emerging gravelly and laced with uncharacteristic hesitance as he broached the subject of a face-to-face conversation aimed at rectifying past missteps with allusions to profound regrets and a desire to reintegrate into our lives, an overture so laden with ambiguity and unspoken histories, including the secrets unearthed from that attic letter, that I abruptly terminated the call midway through his tentative words, my pulse racing in a cocktail of apprehension and reluctant curiosity as I gazed at the blank screen, pondering what unforeseen developments had prompted this resurgence and whether the forthcoming dialogue they proposed held the potential to unearth truths capable of either bridging the chasm or widening it irrevocably beyond repair. That abrupt phone call from Robert echoed persistently in the recesses of my mind throughout the unfolding spring and into the balmy embrace of summer, stirring a maelstrom of speculative scenarios as Tommy embarked on his inaugural engineering internship at a progressive firm in downtown Cleveland that demanded early mornings and late evenings filled with CAD software tutorials and team brainstorming sessions, leaving our home unusually quiet during weekdays and providing me with ample solitary time to sift through the accumulated clutter in the attic once more, where that unearthed letter now served as a talisman of reluctant empathy amid the dust-laden boxes, its revelations about their pre-surgery financial precarity offering a nuanced lens through which to view the wedding extravagance not merely as callous favoritism, but as a precarious gamble to uphold the illusion of familial prosperity for Sarah's sake, while their retirement security teetered on the brink of collapse. Yet this newfound perspective failed to fully absolve the sting of their choices or dismantle the protective barriers I had so laboriously constructed around our life, only complicating the internal dialogue that replayed their voices in my head during quiet commutes to the clinic where I now managed a bustling office with poise honed from years of adversity. Their overtures toward reconciliation persisted with a determination that bordered on dogged persistence, commencing with a series of emails laden with sepia-toned photographs from my childhood summers spent at their modest lakeside cabin in upstate New York, where we had roasted marshmallows over crackling fires and shared stories under starlit skies. Images accompanied by captions evoking the unbreakable bonds of blood that time could not erode, followed by a substantial care package delivered to our doorstep containing sun-ripened Florida oranges nestled in tissue paper alongside a handwritten card from Linda expressing how profoundly they missed the fabric of our extended family and yearned for the simple joy of shared meals once again. Gestures that tugged at the frayed edges of my resolve and plunged me into a profound dilemma about whether to extend even a tentative reply that might invite a cascade of explanations and entreaties I remained unprepared to navigate, because acknowledging them risked validating the very hypocrisies that had driven the wedge between us, while perpetuating the silence, imposed and increasing burden on my conscience, especially as Tommy, now 20 and acutely attuned to relational subtleties, began voicing his own curiosities during our evening walks about the absence of his grandparents from milestones like his prom or internship launch, his probing questions highlighting how my steadfast grudge inadvertently deprived him of potential mentorship and stories from his lineage, a disagreeable entanglement that mirrored their own past misprioritizations and compelled me to question whether My unyielding stance served justice or merely perpetuated a cycle of inherited disconnection that could haunt him long after I was gone. The pivotal twist materialized during a luncheon rendezvous I reluctantly consented to at a nondescript roadside diner equidistant between our Ohio suburb and their downsized Florida condo. A neutral ground selected to minimize the intimacy of home turf where Robert, his once robust frame now softened by age and perhaps the stresses of unforeseen hardships, laid bare the aftermath of the wedding expenditures in a voice tempered by quiet admission, explaining how the $230,000 had spiraled into a vortex of mounting credit card balances and refinance loans that necessitated selling off their original retirement property and relocating to a more affordable unit amid palm trees that felt more like a concession than a paradise. With Sarah's influential new in-laws providing sporadic aid to her household, but offering scant support to my parents, who bore the brunt of the overruns from impulsive decisions like the imported fireworks and extended venue rentals. And as he spoke, Linda interjected with a tremor in her tone about the deepest regret centering on their refusal to assist with Tommy's surgery because it had irrevocably severed the thread of trust they had woven over decades. Her words carrying an authenticity that pierced through my defenses yet rang incomplete without concrete atonement, particularly when I subtly referenced the attic letter's contents and observed the subtle blanching of their expressions, confirming the concealed dimensions of their desperation at that juncture. Amid the awkward pauses filled with clinking silverware and the diner's hum of fluorescent lights overhead, glimmers of humor surfaced to alleviate the tension, such as Robert's self-deprecating anecdote about how his golf handicap had worsened dramatically due to skipped lessons in favor of overtime shifts at a part-time consulting gig to offset vendor payments, prompting me to counter with a light quip about at least the wedding cake's figurines not requiring retirement planning. A remark that elicited strained chuckles around the Formica table, but subtly reinforced the lingering absurdity of their fiscal choices. While in the privacy of my thoughts I characterized the entire lavish affair as that inflated balloon of a celebration which had popped spectacularly, leaving everyone scrambling amid the confetti-strewn debris, a mild vulgarity underscoring the grotesque mismatch between surface glamour and underlying ruin that still fueled my guarded skepticism. In the subsequent weeks, their campaign intensified with invitations to visit their compact new residence for an occasion as innocuous as Tommy's upcoming birthday barbecue, and despite the internal cacophony of warnings urging caution, I acquiesced to a brief excursion southward during a long weekend, transforming the trip into a tentative exploration of fractured ground where the air-conditioned confines of their living room hosted a dinner of grilled mahi-mahi and key lime pie that unfolded like a minefield of superficial pleasantries interspersed with probing questions about our daily rhythms, only for Sarah to arrive unannounced bearing gifts for her nephew wrapped in ostentatious paper that clashed with the subdued atmosphere, her presence injecting an undercurrent of unease as she regaled us with polished tales of her thriving marketing consultancy and the twins' latest antics, while dropping veiled allusions to the family's collective financial recalibration as though it absolved the original betrayal. Her demeanor a blend of contrition and defensiveness that heightened the simmering conflicts by forcing me to mediate between overtures of warmth and reminders of unresolved inequities. As the visit progressed through board games that evoked forced nostalgia and evening strolls along the nearby canal where egrets waited gracefully, I grappled with escalating dilemmas, such as when they solicited my professional advice on consolidating their debts through low-interest options available via the clinic's financial wellness program. A request that appealed to my ingrained sense of familial duty yet threatened to entangle me in the very patterns of enablement that had enabled the wedding's success at our expense, leaving me torn between the satisfaction of withholding and the quiet fear that outright refusal might solidify my role as the unforgiving outlier in their revised family lore. For a calculated measure of reprisal woven into the fabric of that gathering, I regaled them with expansive narratives of Tommy's burgeoning achievements during the post-dinner conversation, elaborating on his internship innovations like a prototype for sustainable energy models and the scholarship offers pouring in from universities that recognized his potential without any external scaffolding, but artfully Interspersed the accounts with offhand observations about how our household had thrived through sheer ingenuity and community support unburdened by distant interventions. The phrasing crafted to illuminate their peripheral status in his ascent with a subtlety that bordered on elegant rebuke. Witty in its emphasis on self-made success and profoundly gratifying as I noted the deepening furrows of remorse etching their brows amid the candlelit table, reclaiming the spotlight of our narrative from the shadows they had cast years prior. Nevertheless, the atmosphere thickened with an impending sense of reckoning as the visit concluded with a lingering embrace from Linda that carried the scent of her familiar lavender lotion mingled with unspoken pleas. Only for the tension to crystallize later that evening upon my return when an errantly forwarded email from Sarah's account infiltrated my inbox detailing their orchestrated plan to descend upon my home uninvited in the coming weeks under the pretext of a surprise delivery intended to facilitate deeper amends, perhaps involving the liquidation of cherished heirlooms like Dad's vintage watch collection to fund a gesture of restitution. And as I absorbed the outline of their strategy in the glow of my laptop screen deep into the night, a swell of uncertainty enveloped me because this bold incursion threatened to precipitate the ultimate confrontation I had both anticipated in my darkest fantasies and dreaded in my most rational moments, poised on the precipice of revelations that could either forge an improbable path to fragile harmony or shatter the remnants of our ties beyond any hope of salvage. That inadvertently forwarded email from Sarah lingered unopened in my inbox for several restless days, like a sealed indictment waiting to be unsealed. Its subject line innocuous enough to blend with the mundane notifications from work and Tommy's college updates, yet carrying the weight of impending intrusion, as I finally clicked it open one overcast evening while rain pattered against the windows of our quiet Ohio home, the contents unfurling a meticulously outlined itinerary for my parents' surprise pilgrimage northward, complete with driving directions from their Florida condo and a tentative arrival time slotted for the following Friday afternoon, all framed as an earnest bid for reconciliation through a tangible gesture of amends that hinted at financial restitution drawn from the proceeds of liquidating Robert's prized vintage watch collection amassed over decades of careful acquisitions, interspersed with allusions to how the wedding's financial fallout had served as a harsh teacher in the art of true priorities and a cryptic mention of Tommy's recent feature in the local newspaper chronicling his engineering award for an innovative solar panel design that they had preserved in a scrapbook as a silent tribute from afar. A detail that twisted sharply because it implied they had monitored our lives peripherally all along without the courage to intervene until their own circumstances demanded a narrative pivot toward redemption. The revelation plunged me into a vortex of churning emotions as I paced the living room floor with the laptop abandoned on the coffee table, my mind racing through the labyrinth of potential responses from a preemptive phone call to firmly discourage their advance and preserve the sanctity of our hard-won autonomy to allowing the encounter to unfold organically in hopes that facing them on my threshold might finally exorcise the ghosts of resentment that had haunted my decisions for so long. Yet the core dilemma paralyzed me with its moral ambiguity because extending forgiveness in this manufactured moment risked undermining the profound lessons of self-sufficiency I had imparted to Tommy, who now thrived at university far from the echoes of familial discord, potentially inviting a relapse into the dynamics of conditional support where weddings once overshadowed surgeries, while rejecting them outright before they even arrived would cast me in the role of the implacable gatekeeper denying an aged couple their shot at atonement. A stance that even I recognized as laced with the same unyielding pride that had fueled their original hypocrisies and might ultimately alienate Tommy further by painting his mother as the architect of perpetual division rather than the guardian of emotional integrity, a disagreeable crossroads that had me oscillating between empathy for their evident decline and a fierce protectiveness over the life we had rebuilt brick by unassisted brick. Their vehicle materialized in the driveway sooner than the email projected, the crunch of gravel under tires announcing their presence on that drizzly Friday as I peered through the sheer curtains from my vantage in the hallway, observing Robert assisting Linda from the passenger seat with a gentleness born of shared hardships. Both clad in unpretentious attire devoid of the flourish they once wielded for social occasions and bearing a weathered cardboard box that suggested burdens heavier than mere apologies, and when the anticipated knock reverberated through the door, soft yet resolute like a heartbeat seeking entry, I drew a steadying breath infused with the scent of fresh rain mingling with the faint aroma of my simmering chamomile tea and turned the knob to reveal them standing there under the shelter of the porch light, their faces illuminated in a mosaic of wrinkles and weariness that spoke volumes about the intervening years, marked by the wedding's unintended legacy of fiscal and emotional austerity. Robert initiated the exchange with a voice roughened by age and emotion, uttering my name Emily in a tone laced with vulnerability as he professed their profound sorrow for the surgery refusal that had rent our family asunder, for the wedding's blind indulgence that had prioritized spectacle over substance, and for every subsequent silence that had allowed the wounds to fester unchecked. While Linda extended the box with trembling hands, revealing its contents as a modest check for $20,000. Painstakingly assembled from the watch sales and small savings scraped together over months of frugality, accompanied by thick sheaves of letters penned individually in their looping handwritings that delved into the intricacies of their regrets, including how the mounting debts from Sarah's event had amplified their terror of financial ruin at the precise moment Tommy's crisis demanded boldness they lacked, and a startling twist materialized in the form of faded receipts documenting anonymous contributions to a regional children's heart fund initiated in Tommy's honor, drawn from Robert's occasional golf tournament winnings over the years. Modest sums dispatched without fanfare to avoid the taint of transactional forgiveness, but now laid bare as evidence of a quiet penance that had sustained them through the estrangement's long nights. The disclosures crashed over me like the gathering storm outside, evoking a turbulent symphony of pity for the toll etched into their postures and the faint tremor in Linda's voice as she implored for a chance to reconnect with Tommy, to weave themselves back into the tapestry of his life as active grandparents sharing in his triumphs and offering the wisdom of their accumulated experiences. Anger at the belated nature of these gestures that could never reclaim the solitary vigils I had kept during his recoveries, or the resentment that had reshaped my worldview into one of guarded independence, and a fleeting whisper of what might have been had they chosen differently from the outset, when $85,000 represented not an insurmountable sum, but a lifeline to preserve the grandson they now sought to embrace. The absence of humor in this raw unveiling, stripping away any veneer of levity to expose the unvarnished truth of our shared frailties, where light vulgarities about past excesses paled against the gravity of potential reconciliation hanging in the balance. As the rain intensified into a steady downpour, drumming on the porch roof and forming rivulets along the siding, the ultimate dilemma crystallized in that suspended instant, with the door ajar between us, my hand lingering on the knob as I weighed the cascade of words that could bridge the gap through tentative acceptance and a shared meal to test the waters of renewed dialogue, or seal it shut with an unvoiced finality that honored the boundaries forged in betrayal's fire. Nearly yielding to the pull of blood ties and the sight of their hopeful eyes reflecting fragments of my own features in a mirror of generational continuity that tempted me toward the disagreeable mercy of second chances, despite the risks of reopened scars. Yet in the end, as thunder rumbled distantly across the darkening sky, I opted for the path of eloquent restraint, stepping back incrementally without uttering a syllable, my gaze holding theirs in a prolonged communion that conveyed the multifaceted depth of the rift encompassing hurt, growth, and irreversible change. Then methodically, drawing the door closed until the latch engaged with a definitive click that echoed through the hallway like the closing of a well-worn book, turning away to the warmth of my interior world while their muffled voices of surprise and disappointment blended with the storm's symphony, fading into irrelevance. In the ensuing days, an enveloping silence descended upon the channels of communication without a single follow-up call or message to pierce the veil I had reinstated, mirroring the quiet I had once imposed and leaving me to contemplate amid the routine resumption of life whether that wordless expulsion had mended more fractures within my soul than it inflicted upon theirs, or if Tommy's independent spirit would one day compel him to extend the hand they could not reach, the ambiguity lingering as a thought-provoking coda on the elusive calculus of family debts, where some ledgers balance through forgiveness and others through the resolute finality of closed doors, pondering eternally. If the peace beyond such thresholds endures or erodes under the weight of what remains unsaid.